So this is the point. We've travelled a little journey through that, which for me was moving from a view from education about where we are generally in education and some of the pointers and directions we might be going in, through some specific examples, the examples of Bloodhound and Frozen Planet, and then coming back to the world view and the challenges that we face in engaging people in science, technology, engineering, maths, and using technology to support that. So I'd like to turn to you now, and if you don't have questions, I do, so please bring your questions so you don't have to hear mine. Please put up your hand if you have a question, and we'll put them to the panel. Oh, that's excellent to begin with. Can we start well, yes, if we start there, and if we have the second one coming here, we'll take 2 questions and then go on from there. Please go ahead.
Okay, well, I'm Emma Rogers from Littlebridge World, and I throughout all the panel speeches, wrote down a couple of phrases. One was, if we get this right, we shouldn't be scared of, and this will become integrated in learning. And I just wonder whether the panel would agree that actually this is a generational thing, and if we still think like that, we're already left behind, and kids are already doing it. I actually do have one other question. I did want to ask Andy. What were you clearing up in the desert, and what did it actually feel like when you were driving that car?
That's 2 questions.
Yeah,
it's
sorry.
Fine. That's one of mine, anyway. And if we take the second question here, and then we'll come to the panel.
I'm John Holman from the Wellcome Trust. Very inspiring to hear about all the potential for technology and its impact on education. But the striking thing for me is actually how slowly things are changing in schools when you consider how fast technology is changing. So this is specifically about schools. It's a bit different in higher education. So I just wondered what the panel felt were the non-technological barriers, to more rapid impact by technology on schools.
Thank you. Thank you both. Michelle, do you want to respond to this?
Yeah, I mean, it was one of the things I did want to pick up, but in 10 minutes you can't, so thank you for asking that question. And I think it goes with your question. I think those 2 questions are really interrelated. It's a generational thing and how slowly schools, things are changing in schools. I think the problem with education, it's so political, you know, and it really is a hot potato, and it's the thing that governments win elections on. And I think that we're very, very risk averse, and it's not just here, it's everywhere in the world, that there are very few countries that really want to bite the bullet and make changes. And we have an assessment system that doesn't really value technology. We have, you know, these ideas that we know that technology can really make a difference to learning, and we've seen evidence of it, and we use it everywhere in commerce, in industry, yet we are very averse to using it in schools because there's no push to do it. And I think if there was more of a push to assess students and use technology in assessment, I think we would start to see a change. And I do think it's a generational thing in one sense. I think maybe in 50 years it'll go away, but that's too long. You know, we've been saying, I've been working in education for more years than I'm cared to tell you, but I've always been involved in trying to change teaching and learning. And I started using technology in education more than 30 years ago. And I saw its potential then. Now, that's over 30 years, and we haven't seen a change. So we've seen 2 generations of teachers go through, and yet we're not seeing a change. So I don't think it's around generation. I think it's much more around the fact that we don't have a school system that values technology and wants and encourages the use of it in all areas, including assessing learning.
Thank you, Michelle. Andy, I think there's a couple of specific questions there.
I'm going to start by saying what she said. The experience is very similar. And in terms of the non-technological barriers, there is a degree of actually breaking down the beliefs and the set ways. Kids are already doing this in some ways. Are we facilitating it right? Are we collectively actually encouraging them to do it? And again, to be very parochial and use the Bloodhound example of, it's all very well having something that the kids can watch at home or whatever, but to answer your other question, if you want to know what it's like, then actually tune into the live feed next year. But don't just tune in, get the school to tune in. And don't just go, oh, all right, that's cool, let's move on to the next thing. And what can we conclude from that? Whether it's looking at the maths of, okay, so how, it depends on the age group you want to look at, how long did it take at that speed to go through 1 kilometre? And how much fuel do you think he burns? That's the same question as, I've got this much money, the shops are this far away, how long does it take to get there, and how many apples can I buy? It's just more interesting maths. It's the same problem. And it makes that jump to, one day, one of those kids is going to be out there building wind turbines or bridges. That's not interesting technology, it's essential technology. You need to get them started on the interesting stuff, you need to facilitate it. They've got that interest, we need to push them onto that next step of, how does that work? You know, you've all got the Samsung iPads and the phones and stuff. We're all, you know, the kids understand how to use that even better than we do. What's inside it? How does it work? Who's going to build the next generation if none of us understand and none of them understand or want to understand how it works? That's the question we have to awaken them. So it's enabling that bit, it's taking that next step. And extending the science lesson to environmental sciences and looking at how the geology and climatology globally forms a very small number of lakes that in long-term, you know, in geological terms, exist for the briefest of times, a few tens of thousands of years, you know, between when they were full lakes and before they've become full-blown deserts. They finish up as lakes that flood in the winter and dry in the summer. That's what we need to run on. The stones on that surface, which is what we're picking up, half of them were grown in situ as mud shale that pops to the surface because of geological movement. The other half started in Antarctica and were actually moved when the continents pushed together, you know, about 4 billion years ago. And there are two distinct kinds of stones. A total of 6,000 tons to be moved by hand. And a great little science lesson: when you arrive on the desert next year, you will walk past a pile of 6,000 tons of stones all in one place. If you could imagine something that's about 2 to 3 meters deep and filling this room, that's what you're going to walk past, shifted by a bunch of the local people by hand. It's, you know, it's an extraordinary human endeavour. And actually, we get fixed on the science and technology. This is about human endeavour. And teaching is about that human interest of the, how does that work? It's igniting that question.
Thank you, Andy. It just occurs to me it wouldn't take you long to get to the shops in that car. Anyway, Rajay.
Two contradictory statements to start with. The first is that this isn't new. So, you know, whether it was in the 60s with teachers saying, what do we do with this huge, you know, new revolution that we've got this box in a corner of the room called a television, and how is that going to transform the way we learn, to floppy disks, you know, apparently going to change the world, to, you know, 5 years ago, no one would have dreamt that you'd spend more time looking at your phone than having it to your ear. So I think, you know, it's not something new. However, when I contradict myself, I say, actually, there is no better time for all of us, collectively, to be at the intersection of education and technology than this moment and this time. If you look at the fact that we have evolved in a way that no one could have imagined within the space of this 10 years. We're going through much greater and much more swifter change than we ever have done before. And I think that that ensures a focus and an intensity on this period of time more so than it does on any of those decades in the past. So where does that leave us? I think it leaves us with two very, very important dimensions. And Emma, I think you're right to ask the question, and John, you are too. The first fundamental is that teachers, tutors, educators are phenomenal people. They are transformational people. They come into this world for the right reasons, and that is to make a difference. So it's not that they are, you know, somehow resistant to it or that it's anathema to them. They want to do the best by their students. But the challenge for all of us is about how we make people comfortable with the new world. Because you're right, there is a generational gap. You look at kids that are growing up now, the most phenomenal thing about an iPad is that you know how to use it before you've touched it. And these kids know how to use this stuff before they've touched it. They're not scared of it. And so there is a challenge about how we acquaint our tutors and our teachers and our lecturers and our academics with our students. And let's get one other thing right. Our students aren't only 10-year-old kids in a classroom and 18-year-old students in a lecture theatre. There are also 34-year-old people trying to gain new qualifications to deal with the new skills that Britain's needs, or they are 88-year-old students that I saw graduate at the Barbican 3 weeks ago. So, you know, they are facing these challenges and issues too. But I think that actually, when you look at the potential, when you look at the scale that can be achieved, when you look at the quality that can be achieved, when you look at the transformational experience that can be achieved, when you look at my mum, who's as technologically illiterate as you can get, sitting on Facebook, you know, as much as she does, we are evolving in a way that we've never evolved before. And I think that that enables the intersection between education and technology to yield even stronger outcomes than we could have imagined 3, 4, 5 years ago. I think that yields us in good stead. We shouldn't be fearful of it. It's part of our lives. We're learning slowly. Keep the fundamentals strong. These are good people trying to do a good job. Let's help them through that process.
Thank you, Rajay. Jim.
You spoiled my story about my mum.
It's not a mum competition.
I bought my mum a desktop computer about 4 years ago, and she got used to surfing. And although in Google she would type the URL into the Google search box rather than the address box, but hey, you know, it worked. And I went back about, because I'm not a good son, I went back about a year later and said, how are you getting on with the computer? She said, I've got rid of it. I said, really? I bought a laptop with a wireless router, she told me. And there she was. And only about six months ago, she bought a new dishwasher, and she had my dad take the laptop and to get the camera pointed at the new dishwasher, where she gave the running commentary to me. It isn't a generational thing, it's an attitude. It was wonderful. She kept telling my dad off and not pointing in the right direction. It's an attitudinal thing. And I can think of Adrian Oldknow, who's must be in his 80s, is he? Who's been doing stuff. He's even older than us, Michelle. Because we've been teaching for 36 years, I worked out. 76.
I wasn't going to tell him.
No, okay. But back at my first school, we had a teletype to Hatfield Polytechnic. I taught in Hatfield, in Hertford, sorry. The computer was in Hatfield. And we had a landline, and it was a teletype. And do you remember BASIC? 10, space, print, quote, Simon Ball School, quote, return. 20, go to 10, return, run. Simon Ball School, Simon Ball School, do you remember? You don't, some of you. And the paper goes out the back, and I'm watching the deputy head. So this is 1976, a deputy head who's probably 90 now. I'm a student teacher watching him. And he just waits, and the paper's going out the window now, and one of the students says, how do you stop it? And he pulls the plug out. And another student says, that can't be right, and he gives the manuals out. He said, it isn't right, work out how to do it properly. So that wasn't an age thing. That was a long time ago, experiential learning. He inspired them because it was crazy. That was his little way of doing it. That really set me up who I am now, that lesson, actually, because there were no boundaries. And there was also one terminal amongst 30 people in his office, where everybody crowded in. We didn't have to have one each. So I think it is about inspiration. It isn't to do with age. Our mums prove that. And, you know, 1976 proves that, when the technology was really hard. It really was hard work to make it happen. So it's about how do we inspire.
Absolutely, I think there's a lot in that. I would just like to add one thing to the question of the non-technological barriers, but I wondered the extent to which systems give us a difficulty. The thing that I've been reflecting on is, what's a political cycle? How long is that? What's an academic cycle or a learning cycle? What's a cultural cycle look like? How long is that? And what does an economic cycle look? Are there sweet spots within those cycles when you overlay them that would help us understand how we can begin to manage the change between them? Just as
Thank you, Gavin. Can I say one more really quick thing?
Yeah.
A controversial thing. You might not believe it, but there's a government somewhere on this planet that's going to ban technology till students are 10 years old. That probably means they've had technology for 9 years of their life, or maybe even 9.5, but when they go into class, they're not allowed to have them. I wonder, how could any country do that? And I wonder which country it is. I'll pass on.
And I'm going to rush us through, myself included, so that we get some more questions. There's one question there, and if we take that one first.
Yeah, mine is more of a comment to Andy Green. I'm from South Africa, and I've listened to you at Wits University inspire young students, particularly from the science faculty physics at that evening. We also a partner in the Bloodhound project. I head the Manufacturing Engineering Sector Council in South Africa. One of the things we did, and that was just one of the questions that came up, how do you inspire people to do other things? First thing government did of the Northern Cape, and Northern Cape is one of our poorest provinces, was to do a poverty index, then do a job creation project, which was cleaning up that particular thing. We as the sector council then got involved in getting 10 technical schools in Kimberley to build cars as part of the project and to participate in the project. So I think that technology can transform a society. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to where the microphones are, so I'm saying do keep putting your hands up. But number 3 now.
Conrad Wolf from Alpha. Comment first and then a question. The comment is, you know, maths and its style of teaching and what it is and the subject matter seems central to me in this discussion about technology. And the kind of maths that Andy's talking about with Bloodhound, you know, is completely different from the kind of mathematics that is being taught around the world. As people who know me well know my view on this. One of the differences is computers do the calculating in a case that we're talking about with the blood count case. You analyze all of these things, and that's what's allowed the world to move forward in technology and science over the last 50 years, but yet we're largely banning that in much of the education around the world. So my comment is, in 20 or 30 years, I strongly believe we will have computer-based maths in education. Should we be getting there by inventing a new subject that eventually becomes mainstream, or by turning the current mainstream subject into something that makes sense?
Thank you, Conrad. And we'll do one more question here and then allow you to answer.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Paul Streletsky. I'm speaking in my role as a visiting professor at Manchester University in the engineering departments. Just one comment about inspiration. I was just thinking before that 2 weeks ago I had a call from a chap I know as Ernie. He was the guy who taught me physics, and he asked me how his touch screen on his iPad worked, and I had to get back to him on the answer. And because he'd inspired me to be an engineer, we're still in touch. But my question is a different one, and a sort of a serious and factual one. At our university, like many in the UK, if any of our foreign guests here, you know, would want to choose anywhere to train their engineers, then the UK is clearly a great place. One of the reasons it's a good place is they tend to come, and I'm thinking particularly of Chinese students, with great mathematics skills for engineering. And like it or not, engineering is kind of hard. You know, in Olympic terms, no pain, no gain. Calculus, integrating by parts, it's hard stuff and you have to learn it. And one of my concerns is that the output from the UK's educational system is often lacking in terms of those hardcore mathematical skills to enter the education of engineering. And what we see is highly talented individuals, A-star students from the UK establishments, arriving, and in Olympic terms, you know, they all set off together with the foreign students and the Chinese, but the guys disappear. They're out the blocks quicker and they get demotivated. And so I think there's a serious issue here. The technology will move on. Don't be surprised in 10 years when we think Facebook and Twitter's, you know, old-fashioned. It will be. That moves forward, but hardcore mathematics for engineering is still a prerequisite, and I think we need to, you know, consider those things seriously.
Thank you. So, hardcore mathematics. So, I think we have 2 questions which are related on the math side, or which may be related. So that question about, do we need to invent a new subject? And how do we deal with the disparity, if you like, between levels of maths that are coming through? Jim?
I think Michelle touched on it earlier, Conrad, about making learning authentic. And whether or not we get rid of the subjects as we know them, or whether we have new subjects, it has to be authentic and it has to mean something in the space where they are. It worries me as well that in doing that we sort of dumb everything down, and we don't get to the point where people actually have ever heard of partial differential equations or whatever else. And you know, I know there are people who say that students should, you know, this authentic learning is taken too far sometimes. You know, why should somebody know that even partial differential equations exist, never mind learn how to solve them? On the other hand, I remember in my maths degree when we did the Navier-Stokes equation and we had to cross out 90% of the bits of it to be able to solve it, we then didn't have Mathematica or a tool that could help us solve it at the time in the 70s. There's some sort of fusion got to happen. We got to get people out of their Polaroid positions of, you know, every child in the school has got to get to this level of mathematics. Because if we take them all to age 18, I tell you, because we haven't got the stock of teachers who can be inspirational mathematics teachers. They just don't exist. In fact, I think I read somewhere that if every single mathematics graduate became a mathematics teacher, we'd still be short. And in India, by the way, there are meant to be 8.2 million teachers. There are only 7 million. There are 1.2 million teachers short in India. So it isn't a case of, you know, I think of 50,000 schools where there are no teachers. It's a huge issue. But I think getting the balance between what is it students really should know as opposed to what we think they should know. And that's the battle about how far down the equation route we should go. It's being challenged at the moment by MIT with the Centre for Curriculum Redesign. They're going to look at what the curriculum should look like.
Yeah, I mean, there's two issues here, I think. One is curriculum and ensuring it's relevant for the modern workforce and modern jobs. There's a second, which is about the knowledge base and the knowledge balance in our economies and in our countries. To deal with the first one, I mean, I suspect we'll see a gradual evolution as we will with everything else. You know, my view is that, you know, sometimes amongst all this new fancy stuff, and, you know, we all get excited about potential for technology, actually there are some things that we've got to just be pure about and got to say are important. You know, the 3 R's are important. And we've got to ensure that people have basic competencies that enable them to succeed and to flourish in the world, regardless of what that world looks like. And so,
but the argument is, what is the level of that basic competency? And some people would say, I put words in your mouth, unless they can solve differential equations, they're not a well-rounded human being. I know you didn't say that. But, you know, the level is crazy. We're pushing people too far.
I'll come on to that in just a moment, and we may well disagree just a little, Jim. So, you know, English, science, mathematics, fundamentals, which, you know, I don't think we need to redesign or recalibrate what these subjects look like. Yes, they will evolve. Yes, they will be better tuned to the world that we're living in. Yes, they'll be tuned to the employers that are now going to emerge. But I don't think we need to sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater. In terms of the wider question about the balance, and Jim is right to raise the question, I think all of that is a concern, and you're right to raise both of them. I think there is another one which I'm very anxious about, which is that amongst all of this focus on getting a better qualified workforce, better educated populations, we've now changed the bar. So the bar used to be you've got to have an undergraduate qualification, preferably a 2-1, preferably a good, well-standing university in order to get into most of the jobs that employers are competing for. The bar is now moving very, very quickly towards postgraduate qualifications in order to get many of the jobs in our economy. And that creates a huge challenge and a huge tension that I don't think we've properly grappled with. If 45% of the population now going into higher education, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, I think it's a good thing that we have a well-qualified workforce, but there is a question there about if the bar continues to rise and the bar is now a master's or a PhD, then what does that mean for our society? What does that mean for the most disadvantaged in our societies? What does that mean for social mobility? What does that mean for the sorts of skills and qualifications that employers are demanding? That's a question that is a ticking time bomb for all of our economies. It's certainly emerging in China and India, but it's going to emerge here over the coming years, and I'm not sure we've got an answer for it yet.
Shall I move to additional questions? So if you have quick points, put them in, but then we'll get some additional questions.
I would like to pick up on Conrad's point. Sorry, Stephen's point. Conrad, I always get you two mixed up. So I think, you know, your idea of changing to a more, either changing or as a new subject, I think it has to be change. Because, you know, how many people, if I asked you in this room to put up your hands if you said if you were no good at maths, there would be several people in this room who would probably put their hands up. But if I said, only of you and no good at reading, nobody would put their hands up. Nobody would ever declare that. So we're doing something wrong in maths education. We really are. And if we need to do something to change it, I think we need to focus on numeracy for the masses, and then to address your point, to make sure that those who are going to have aspirations, who are succeeding, can go on and do the hard stuff, what we really need. But I think trying to lump it all together, it's the same way we lump IT together. We can't do that. Math has so many facets, and we need to think about actually separating out the same way we need to separate IT skills out.
Can I just briefly
Go on, Andy.
add to that with an example? To follow on from what you said, and to be slightly provocative, maths is a language. It is the language of science. If you are not going to learn to speak partial differential equations, then you are effectively having all your conversations on Twitter, which is a great way of communicating 90% of the time, but there are concepts and conversations you can't have in 140 characters. You need to understand, at least on some occasions, which terms of the Navier-Stokes equations, I know what I meant, have been crossed out, so you understand the limitations of your answer. And I speak personally as somebody who is strapping into a car that has used computational fluid dynamics to estimate the solutions of Navier-Stokes, which is going to keep me on the ground, we hope. But we're actually going to go and test that. And here's the bit where Bloodhound starts to bring it real. You don't need to understand Navier-Stokes. You don't need to understand partial differential equations. You just accept here's an equation, we cross out all that, computer estimates the result, and here are the results in the real world. So you have to understand... Yeah, exactly. And most of the time they can, but you need to understand where the limitations lie. So it's a new part of a widening science, and teaching maths gets harder and harder as the field gets wider, because you need to be able to speak partial differential equations sometime, and the rest of the time you can communicate in Twitter because the computer gives you the answers.
It's not often I get to say this, but I can see us talking partial differential equations over lunch. But let's move to 3, then 1, please.
Hello, David Frost, Chairman of the Studio Schools Trust. I would like to suggest there is a complete and utter disconnect from what the panel is talking about and eulogising about the use of technology to an audience that's already switched on to actually what's happening in the real world. And that is that this year there will be hundreds of thousands of young people will be leaving schools in this country who will neither have 5 decent GCSEs or in many cases have no educational qualifications whatsoever. Yet, they all have the latest smartphones, they all have access to PCs, they frequently have tablet computers, but somehow the technology has totally failed to stimulate them to learn. As the riot showed last year, they're quite capable of organising themselves to create mayhem, but they're incapable or show no desire to learn technology to learn. And when I go around the country, and I have done for many years speaking to employers, what they will tell me is that many of the schoolies who come and see them, yes, may well be able to use a smartphone, but are totally unable to communicate, have no ability to work as part of a team, and lack any enterprising skills whatsoever. So the question I would ask, and I'm interested in, is that the technology may be one part of the equation, but it cannot, as it's been proven, be that alone. How do you intend, or how do you see the world emerging where the technology is made for a positive use, and where people who have smartphones, which virtually the whole of the population now has, sees it as a way of actually learning for self-improvement rather than for a self-selected elite that are doing so at the moment?
Thank you for that question. I'm sure there are lots of comebacks to that. Number 1, please.
Am I on here? Thanks. Andrea Carr from Rising Stars, publishers here in London. I think, I'm sure most of us can see, and we've heard, the value of bringing the outside world into classrooms to engage learners, and whether those be heart surgeons or mechanical engineers, we can see the value in it, no question. As most probably know, last week, rather surreptitiously, on the day of the opening of London 2012, our Department of Education here announced that many schools, many state schools in this country, would not have to employ teachers with qualified teacher status. So in other words, teachers might be employed who are not qualified teachers. I'm interested in knowing whether the panel feels that that is a positive step, in overcoming those sorts of barriers that you've been talking about this morning?
Thank you, Andrea. Anyone like to jump in?
Yeah.
Andy, go ahead.
Great point about the technology just bypassing a whole generation. And actually, that's very firmly confirms in my mind that it was the right thing to do with start with a couple of sportsmen up here. Not just because it's the Olympics, but because if you want, there's a whole generation out there who don't do any exercise. Sport isn't something that happens on TV. Sport is something that takes effort and discipline and interest to start with, and we need to reach out to get them to think about a little bit of effort and teamwork and interest, and make sport being something they do on the sports field at weekends and not watch on TV while they become part of our burgeoning medical problem for the future. So it's not just a STEM problem that you're identifying, it's a society problem, and we need to engage them along all those different lines to change the way a percentage of the population is thinking about the way they look after themselves and the way they engage physically and intellectually with the outside world.
Excellent, thank you.
Can I ask a question back to you? You run studio schools, which is quite a different model from standard schools. I hope that you can tell me that most of the students leaving your schools are not like that, and that they are achieving, they are using technology to learn, they are using everything they have around them. As I said in my talk right at the beginning, that technology on its own is not the answer. It's about changing the whole paradigm in schools, and studio schools are quite famous for changing that. So, I mean, it'd be interesting to hear from you what your students are achieving and what's different from what's happening in standard schools.
Well, I think in response to that very quickly, I mean, I think there's 2 points that come out of that. One, studio schools are in their formative stage. There's another announcement of another 15 last week, but there's only be 50 by the end of next week. But the whole focus of this morning being on project-based learning, that is the very heart of the curriculum of a studio school, and it's quite clear from the evidence that I see that is working. But I think what it's thrown up, and it's been mentioned before, there is a huge conservatism with a small c in the educational establishment who are at a local level are threatened by new initiatives which may have an impact on existing structures, and I think also at national levels as well. But the bottom line, I keep on, I will come back to this, is that we are getting a polarization in society. Those that are capable of using technology are doing so, and they're doing so extraordinarily effectively. But you've got others that have access to it but show no interest in learning whatsoever. And simply to say that technology is somehow the answer, it's only one small part of it. It's how you actually switch those young people on.
And I think exactly. I mean, that's the point I think we've been trying to make. You've got to find ways to switch them on and get them engaged and get them excited about something. And that's the point that, as you said, that Sally and Steve made this morning. And find ways to motivate them. And I think an awful lot of these technologies that these kids have in their hands are closed down and not allowed inside the school gates. And so they don't know how to use them for learning. I mean, for some it's intuitive, but for others it isn't. So we do have to think about, the way we work. The professional development of teachers is absolutely paramount to this, because they're the ones who are there to support and inspire students. And if they're not doing that, then we need to change that.
Michelle, can I bring in Jim?
I think it is, again, a polarised view to say that nobody is using technology to learn, because, and one of the dangers about what I'm going to say is that I'm going to paint a picture which isn't common. And I think Michelle started off at the beginning by saying, and I think, and you're saying it now, in your set of schools, things are happening, but we don't see it across enough schools. And you've only got to go on YouTube. If you want to know how to do anything, my iPhone, the battery was only lasting 5 minutes. I sent it to Vodafone. They said it would cost £120. I said, well, send it back. I went on YouTube. I found a 16-year-old, told me how to take the cover off. In fact, I'd scratched the front case, so I bought a new face for £7.50, a battery for £7.50, and a screwdriver for £1.29. Did it myself. I lost the screw, but that's another story. But but that was a student doing it the other way, putting some learning himself on. And there are, what was your for every second, there are 5 years worth of videos loaded on the internet of one form or another. I think you had on your slide earlier, Michelle.
Yeah.
But it is happening, My concern is we don't help teachers. So somebody said before about teachers, that they have a hard job. You know, I don't know if you've ever taught 5 one-hour lessons on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday and Friday, and then started again the next week. It's darn hard work. And you get into a treadmill. And we don't help teachers to analyse the curriculum to find out when, for this particular learning objective, you should take them to a museum on a trip. And for this particular learning objective, we'll explore this. And for this one, we'll work collaboratively. And this one will do. That analysis of how the curriculum is delivered, what the learning modalities are, and I'm not talking about making sure every learner gets their learning style, all that stuff, that's another debate. But the analysis of the curriculum match between the learner's style, the content itself, and the teacher's, strengths is sorely lacking in how we help train teachers and how we support them. And of course, in the economic climate where we are, what's being cut? Professional development funds. So it's getting worse, in fact, to help teachers do that. So absolutely, students, just because they know shortcuts on a tablet, just because they know how to do Alt-Tab on a PC to change screens, doesn't mean they know how to use that for learning. Absolutely not. So the teacher has got, the orchestrator has got, a new role. But we're not helping that orchestrator of learning know how to employ this brand new set of learning accessories that's now there on the table to embed that into the learning process. That's where we're failing education.
I just want to bring you to Andrea's point about qualified teachers. And just a view on that.
I'll let you into a secret. You know, when I got my maths degree, I wanted to go straight into teaching, and some of my friends had been to teacher training college and said, Jim, it's a waste of time. Go straight in, because in 1976 I could with a maths degree. So I went straight into teaching, but I had to do a 2-year probationary period rather than the 1 year, which it was at the time. And I was very lucky at Simon Ball School to have a mentor who was wonderful. He really taught me how to teach. You know, he taught me the craft of the classroom, about how to make the kids come in an orderly way and all the sorts of things he did. I was so lucky. So I then got my qualified teacher status in 1978, but I haven't got a teaching qualification of my own. So therefore, basically there's nothing wrong with it, but I was lucky. I had an environment where someone helped me through all the things. The mistakes I made were awful.
Well, I went the same route as Jim, and it wasn't until I did my master's 14 years later. I was 14 years in the classroom, then I did my master's. And I came out of that a completely different person and completely different understanding about learning. So I'm absolutely 100% wedded to the fact that we need teachers in classrooms who know how to curate the learning environment, who know how to orchestrate it, who really understand learning, deeply understand learning. Subject matter expertise is somehow not quite as important. You can bring the subject matter as experts, and you obviously need to know your subject. But I do absolutely fundamentally recoil when we talk about not having trained teachers in schools. But what we need to do is change the nature of that training.
Thank you, Michelle. Rajay.
Very quickly.
And then we'll go to two probably coming towards the last questions. We'll see how we go. But Rajay.
Quickly on both questions. Andrea, my biggest contention here is that we do not value, reward and support our teachers enough. I don't think we pay our teachers enough. I don't think that there's enough support. I think that often they feel like they're alone in trying to get through the experience. And I think that any society that doesn't put enough recognition on the people that will train and upskill and have a huge influence on their next generation is certainly not doing enough. And I think that would be my biggest contention there. David, your question is absolutely fundamental. I've got a few points on this. The first is that I absolutely agree with you. Technology is never going to be the whole answer. Technology is going to be a part of the answer. And the reason why it's never going to be part of the whole answer is that there is no magic bullet here. This issue is going to be one that we are talking about in 10, 15, 20 years' time. The challenge for us is how do we meet the challenge of the day? And in this room, on our watch, there are 1 million people, young people under 25, who are not in education, employment or training, on our watch. That means that we've got a responsibility to meet that obligation and to meet this current situation. But my sort of broad answer to you, and I'll give you one specific example of this, is artificial barriers. My real worry is that we've created artificial barriers, whether it's between education and employment, between teachers and learners, between private and public sector, in a way which isn't helpful. We should break those barriers down in order to get the sorts of outcomes that we need. Let me give you one very specific example with my big lottery fund hat. I launched a program last year that we've just launched called Volunteer It Yourself, to try and deal with this NEETs issue. This is a £50 million investment that we're making, a partnership between Wix, which is one of the biggest DIY firms in the UK, City and Guilds, and London Youth, who have young people centres right across the UK. So young people come in who are NEETs, they get trained up by the Wix decorators, painters, electricians, plumbers, all the rest of it. They get City and Guilds qualifications as a result, and they go into their local youth clubs, their local youth centres, to go and refurbish and redo their centres. They get a good community asset, they get a qualification, they're able to develop those skills, and the community is giving back to those young people. It's an example of bringing the public, private and voluntary sector together. It's an example of bringing generations together, and it's an example of moving away from the usual conception about education and training simply being in the classroom and actually being in other environments too. I think that's one way of getting there. A final point I'd make to you is that we also face, I think, and we touched on this earlier with maths, a big issue, in my opinion, that we put under the blanket at our peril around races and around different movements in terms of where our kids are going. Chinese and Indian students in particular seem to be doing very, very well when it comes to maths and those sorts of subjects. I think in this country especially, we face a real issue in neglecting our white working class kids and our white working class boys in particular, who feel disenfranchised from the education system and don't feel that it relates to them. And Volunteer itself is one of those examples where we're trying to deal with that. But breaking down those artificial barriers, regardless of where they sit and where they exist, I hope is part of the answer.
Thank you, Rajay. Right, question 1 and question 3. So one first.
More of a statement than a question. And it builds on what was Lars said in the statement earlier about the focus on teachers. We talked extensively this morning about teachers almost being the font of knowledge. If we look at staff within school, there's a far wider range of staff who can take a key role. And secondly, it's the role of parents as catalysts, the students with the technology at home, and the way in which I've worked with schools and within school improvement services. At the moment, I'm lead director in South East Wales Education Achievement Service, and trying to harness the parents and recognise the significant contribution that other staff within school that build on the role of the professional teachers and work with the professional teachers gives us a far wider resource in which to deliver that passion that's for students and inspiration in the use of technology.
Thank you. And question 3.
Neil Gorman, Vice Chancellor, Nottingham Trent University. I just wanted to bring you back to the slide behind you. And I think we must not leave this room without celebrating the great success of higher education and education in the UK. Because we've started to talk it down, and really it is one of the best things that the UK has. And if you care to speak to the Minister over lunch, he's word perfect on all the outputs of the university. But I do think it's important. Trinity College has gained more Nobel Prizes than the entire population of France. You know, we can go on of the great successes. It's been lovely today to have 2 Nobel Prizes from the UK with 2 athletes, because we already have our gold medal winners. And we mustn't leave the room. I take the point on the engineering, which I'll come to in a moment. We have great engineers. They've just won a Nobel Prize at the University of Manchester for some astonishing work. Now, the Open University has done a fantastic job, and you said it started in 1969. Exactly the same year, we closed the last technical school. And that year, Germany doubled the number of technical schools at that time.
And I've, in my past life, employed loads of German engineers of the highest quality that have come through that system. Because we celebrated as a society in Germany the fact that engineers are good people. You know, it wasn't ashamed, you know, to your family to be an engineer. And I think that the resurgence of the UTCs, which you were commenting on, it's a bit late, unfortunately, for me. I'd like them to have been there. The final point, because I could go on forever about the great success of our education, is the point you made about the school in Australia. And then you made the comment that education is very political in the UK. What there isn't in that state in Australia, there aren't league tables. There aren't, they are not going in to examine at a tick box approach of quality.
I'm sorry they've
providing. They have, right? The success of that school is out with a system of over-regulation. That's my point. And Nicholas Nicoponti, who runs the media lab at MIT, gave a speech very similar to yours, said the problem we have in maths and creativity actually is beating the creativity out of children in the primary school. And I think we're still guilty of doing that in this country and getting them to celebrate creativity rather than put them into a process.
Thank you for that point. Well, I'm not going to go to the panel for this because I think we're very close to the end, but what some of this discussion reminds me a little bit is of the opening ceremony of the Olympics and the great acclaim that got because of the humour and the self-deprecation and the reflection that it involved. And I think what we've done today is have a little bit of the reflection on education, some of the challenges we face. The honesty with which we face those challenges, I think, is what makes one of the big things that makes our system great. And our education system has huge strengths, but we are open to looking and reflecting on what we're doing and how we can continue to improve it. And I hope that this discussion has taken us through an awful lot of that as we've gone. So maybe it didn't have all the humour of Roddy Doyle, but sorry, Danny Boyle. I better get that right. Roddy Doyle's pretty funny too. But of Danny Boyle's opening ceremony. But I hope that it's been food for thought. I hope that food for thought will be joined by real food shortly in the lunch. And what I would like to say is thank you to UKTI for bringing us all together for this discussion and this debate. Thank you all for attending it and contributing to it with your questions, and I hope continuing the discussion as we go. And I hope, as a result of that, continuing to reflect on and improve our education systems wherever they may be. But thanks especially to our panel members, so Michelle, to Andy, to Rajay, and to Jim. Thank you very much indeed.